Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we're doing a kind of general politics hot takes episode. And we're going to start with kind of a broad strokes picture of the presidential primary in the Democratic Party. Because there's been a lot of discussion, Bernie is in, Elizabeth Warren is in, approximately 14 quadrillion random Democrats from around the country, Jay Inslee from Washington, John Hickenlooper, who certainly will win the most comical name contest among all the candidates.
say that 5 times fast. No, but really. Hickenlooper? Is that the name?
Hickenlooper, yep.
Can we both say it 5 times fast? Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Hickenlooper, 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 Hickenlooper. Everyone should play at home.
It's easier than you think because
That's true.
It doesn't have the tripping up. You make a good tongue twister. It has to be sounds that are difficult to make one after the other.
That's actually Hickenlooper is quite a nice ring.
It's like a poetic meter to it.
Actually, it's quite nice now that we say it a lot.
Hickenlooper, you could be ancient Greek there. Mayan and That's the first line.
We gotta get Dante back on to say Hickenlooper.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
At Reed College, they teach you the only ancient Greek I know is the first line of the Iliad.
No kidding. Do it. Can you do it?
I just read about out half of it.
Do it again.
But it goes Meenen aedetea peleiadia Achilleos. I probably fucked that up horribly, but you can't
That's
call
gotta
me.
Be the open.
You can't call me on it because all the ancient Greeks are dead, and no one knows if I've actually done it incorrectly.
Except Dante. Dante knows.
Well, he could probably, give me the sort of received wisdom about, how they think, but it's a dead language. Where were we? So
true. Yeah, there's a big 2020.
We got
field
distracted.
For
Dems.
Yeah.
There's a gigantic cast of moderates in there. There's the one left, like unequivocally left candidate, Bernie Sanders.
Spoil it. Don't spoil it. We're gonna place all these people in categories soon.
Right.
It's fun.
Yeah, but we got to. I think we can sort of put them on the spectrum generally. Then you have a kind. Your kind of Brandeis antitrust candidate, Elizabeth Warren, and then you have this undifferentiated mass of people who are sort of like on board maybe with bits and pieces of the other two traditions, but don't really have a ton of credibility. So,
and you're teasing a little bit of a great taxonomy from a 4-part series you did last year, right? Wasn't it last year?
Yeah.
So there's a 4-part series of the different kind of ideological strains or categories that you saw within the Democratic movement or Democratic Party, kind of writ large, that you see as ideologically distinct. And that can be, I think, very helpful. And like you said, actual politicians can shift over time. They can shift in their rhetoric. They can say one thing and do another. But in terms of what actually is done, we could properly fit people into categories in this way to help illuminate and differentiate, I think.
Yeah, and so there are basically 4. There's 3 big categories and one sort of unfilled category. Maybe we can start from right to left. On the right of the party, you have neoliberals, and this is Hillary Clinton and her career as a public servant. Today, Joe Biden, unequivocally the neoliberal candidate. And neoliberalism is all, this is basically a descent of classical liberalism in the 19th century. The liberals of David Lloyd George, and Herbert Spencer, that type of tradition emerging from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, the classical economists. And that's all about sort of political democracy and economic kind of royalism. The capitalist domination of the system, and sort of laissez-faire economic policy, deregulation, low taxes, no unions, incentives for job creators in the modern parlance. To where in our episode with Thomas Friedman, he talks about grow the pie Democrats. That's a false slogan, but in terms of the way they present themselves, that's what they're that's their basic kind of ideology, and that's been a strong tradition in the Democratic Party. I would say from the mid 1970s. Things were a little bit muddled up through the, you had conservatism in the party, but it was mostly racial conservatism. There were a lot of Democrats in the South who were like violently racist, but also had like fairly lefty economic views, so long as that didn't interfere with their racism. Some of them, even like Hugo Black famously was a member of the KKK, but then later renounced his racism after serving, FDR, and he became like a real racial liberal when he was appointed to the Supreme Court. But so, in the Democratic Party from like basically the mid-1970s, the neoliberal tradition is all about that. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, deregulate, cut taxes, cut welfare, push people into the market institutions. All social policy has to be achieved through market mechanisms, and the only what we must do, the kind of core of it, I would say the core neoliberal moral tenet is that humanity must discipline itself to the self-regulating market instead of the other way around. That if people are poor, they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and move to a new city or whatever instead of changing the economy so that they aren't poor anymore.
And there's a lot of interesting things to be discussed here, because this is a term that a lot of people think is meaningless or amorphous, not understanding that the term has a history, of course, and not understanding that there is an actual political philosophy and a certain understanding of the role of markets and capital as substituting for politics. And so if you have, because you talked about Reagan and Thatcher, so people might say, well, but aren't they just neocons or what's the difference between neocons and neoliberals and so forth? And how can you have Bill Clinton and Thatcher as in the same category, right? So, Bill Clinton, of course, the famous triangulator, became famous for catchphrases like the era of big government is over. And I think that speaks, don't you think, to what neoliberalism really is, which is you might differ from conservatives with respect to non-economic issues, right? Like identity politics in terms of race and gender and so forth. But when it comes to fundamental questions of allocation of resources and who makes decisions over economic reality, and when it comes to economic justice, there is this notion that government should stay out of it as much as possible, and the role of government is to aid the markets in allocating things through the invisible hand in a way that's deferential to that flow of capital. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's basically accurate, with the sort of provision that, for people who have read their Karl Polanyi, the idea that the state should stay out of anything is like a logical impossibility. But yes, you have left neoliberals and you have right neoliberals. The weird thing about America as compared to a lot of European countries, especially like Germany and Austria, is that for most of like the kind of last third of the 20th century, both parties basically accepted kind of classical liberal tenets as their foundational political ideology. And so the right neoliberals were all about cutting, just saying like no welfare, just get rid of all the supports for the poor, and just like use the discipline of starvation and desperation to force people into market institutions. And the left neoliberals were like, well, you don't want people to starve, but you want to sort of like structure their incentives such that that they get paid more. Poor people get their income topped up through the EITC. Like, this is a classic neoliberal move. Bill Clinton, in the mid 1990s, he cuts traditional welfare, which is just like this little tiny scraps of income to very poor mothers, and it was just a straight up government handout. And he replaced it with the EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit. And in the context of like not having the EITC is okay, right? But the thing about that was that it took income away from the extremely poor, like the very poorest people in the country, moved it to the people who are like just like a little bit below the poverty line, people who have a job and it pays shit. And like those people need help, but they don't need help as much as the very, very poorest people. And it's like the saying, like, oh, just, we're giving this government handout, quote unquote, just this like straight up transfer from the state to poor people. Like, that's bad. What you have, if you're going to do a handout, it's got to be through the market institutions, and this kind of neurosis, and so that I think is so it's like the left neoliberals try to alleviate the devastation of capitalism, but they always have to do it through market institutions, and therefore their efforts are always circumscribed and in many cases like basically crippled when you're talking about poverty, because poverty is caused by a lack of market income, and so you can never do it through market institutions because
and what
go ahead.
What's fascinating is, and this is a distinction that I think becomes very interesting, is the actual analysis of how human nature and this political economy interacts. The assumptions are very similar. But what you have with the left neoliberals as opposed to the right neoliberals is like a little bit of, compassion, but the same overall moral judgment and analysis of what causes poverty, actually, in a weird way. It's like, if only people, right, were responsible, we should reward and incentivize. Because the whole notion of incentives suggests that it's like lack of individual personal motivation. And so if we just like hang the carrot in front of the lazy person's face, they'll like chase after the carrot, right? So it's like both the same diagnosis of what's causing poverty as the right, and it's the same moral condemnation that handouts aren't deserved because those people are just lazy. Right. And so it is actually way more similar to the reactionary right than you might otherwise think. But there's this kind of soft compassion, which is kind of this condescending, like, well, we don't want to totally screw these people over, even though they're lazy and should be shamed into acting better. Right. So yeah. It is almost indistinguishable.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just like a slight difference in priority, but the basic foundational political economy is very similar between Obama and Reagan, and like they basically share the same assumptions.
There's a reason that Obama loved Reagan in his actual. Well, his praise of Reagan was in Reagan's ability to speak to both sides and bring people together in unity, which is kind of weird. But so to be fair to Obama, he didn't praise him for specific policy issues. But there is a way in which they did see the world, I think, in very similar ways. I wonder if we can't play. The kind of Jeff Foxworthy, and this is probably dating us because I don't know if anyone knows who he is anymore. But you might be a redneck if you do this, you might be a redneck. We could do that with neoliberalism. You might be a neoliberal if. That could be fun.
Yeah.
Even anything. So if you think that the solution to public education is to create a competition and a race to the top, you might be a neoliberal.
Yeah, if you think the solution to poverty is to boost up education credentials, then you might be a neoliberal.
If you think that the problem with mass incarceration is the lack of body cams and reporting, you might be a neoliberal.
If you think that the problem with financial regulation is that it didn't capture the true value of financial allocation from Wall Street properly, you might be a neoliberal.
This is fun. I invite our audience to come up with their own and submit them. We can read off the best ones.
You could probably think of some better ones.
Yeah. Well, this to be fair, we just came up with this off the top of our heads just now. So.
Yeah. But this maybe makes for a good transition point to our second school of thought, which is the Brandeis school. These are the trust busters.
Right.
Lewis.
Oh, but
Lewis
real quick before we get there, should we tell everyone the 2020 candidates that are neoliberals? It's the biggest category, so it's kind of hard to do. But you said Joe Biden. You said Hillary's not running, but she typifies it. Cory Booker strikes me as a classic neoliberal.
Yep.
He has some progressive policies here and there, and we can get to what happens if your typical person in a category has one thing that's outside of it. But Cory Booker, Joe Biden, I don't know who else would you say? Let's see.
I would say at this point,
I don't know who else is declared.
Kirsten Gillibrand is sort of like talking a good game on certain things and then kind of retreating, fundraising on Wall Street. Pete Buttigieg. I don't know.
That was a good one. That was such a bad pronunciation that Emma in the
must
background
not be
laughed
named.
really hard.
Pete Butthole. That one mayor guy who looks like a gigantic baby. Anyway, if everyone will stop heckling me, I could get my thoughts in order here.
There we go.
I would say virtually everyone except for the big two that we'll discuss later are neoliberal to some degree or another. And you can see the neoliberal dogma when you people like
Klobuchar for sure is a great example.
There you go. That's perfect. No
like
Green
Town
New
Hall.
Deal. No, yes. No free college. We can't afford free college. It would cost $60 billion, which is coincidentally less than the annual budget increase of the U.S. military just in the last year. We spent $13 billion on an aircraft carrier where the bomb elevators and the catapults don't work, and but that's about defending America by something. So
if people want to know what neoliberalism is, Amy Klobuchar is perfect because it becomes about personality, and I'm willing to stand up in my words to Donald Trump, and I think what he's doing is unjust. And then when it comes to actual policy that would help people's lives, we'll see. I don't know. I mean, don't rock the boat.
Yeah, and I'd say it's like the real sort of moral center of neoliberalism is, there's the acronym TANSTAFL. There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's a very core premise to this kind of thinking, and it's that this is the basic motivation behind deficit scaremongering, that you can't times are tough, whatever times happen to be, they're always tough, and that the American people need to tighten their belts, and they need to be austere and strict, and they need to be good little Protestant fucking bees, and they need to sacrifice and drink their tough medicine, and it's all about strictness and discipline and austerity.
I like what you're saying there with the bees, because it occurs to me that neoliberals love drones. They love bees that are drones. They love drones that bomb people. They just like drones of all kinds.
Yeah. There is you may not know this, on the Utah state flag, there is a beehive.
Nice.
Because it's supposed to be, but it's a very different kind of implication, because in that case, the beehive is supposed to be about like collective industry. Is there sort of like theocratic communism that was the like underlying very weird and peculiar basis of that the state of Deseret before they got basically annexed by the United States. Anyways, setting that aside, so you have your neoliberal cohort, basically every candidate to some extent, except for the big two. And one of the big two is Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren is a classic Brandeis disciple.
Justice Brandeis?
Yeah, he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson. I think he was the first Jewish person on the Supreme Court. Is that true? I can't remember.
It sounds right.
But
let me look it up.
Anyway, so really influential thinker in the early 20th century. He's a Supreme Court justice for most of the New Deal. And he put forward a sort of like regulated capitalism version of a kind of basic ideology that would come to play I think a decisive influence on the New Deal like structure. Because in the early New Deal, they tried a lot of like pretty radical experiments in economic planning and stuff, and they mostly kind of folded up, like the National Industrial Recovery Act, and they had this like big bureaucracy churning out all these regulation codes and endorsing sort of monopolies, and it just like didn't really work, and then it got declared as unconstitutional. So they tried a different approach, after that kind of didn't work, with basically antitrust and regulation. And the idea there is that, number one, in any sort of market, you want to have like a decent number of competitors. Doesn't mean you just sort of like split things up so that, there are like millions and millions of businesses. But it means that, when you start seeing real concentration, so like, for example, I think with the purchase of 21st Century Fox Entertainment assets by Disney after they acquired LucasArts, that will be like 50% of the box office revenue in the country, probably, will be owned by Disney. So
that seems like a lot.
Yeah, that's just like, and so you're saying basically you just carve up the business. You don't even have to do it as a regulator. You just order the business to do it. Say, break yourself up into 2 or 3 parts. Because we want to say, no more than 10% of this market can be accounted for by one business. And we don't even really care how you do it. You just make sure that this happens. And then the other thing is regulated competition is about structuring the market to make competition happen along socially positive axes, right? So if you're, thinking about competition, you can have competition happening with sort of like monopolist competition where, like how Jeff Bezos drove diapers.com out of business by undercutting them. Or you could have the sort of competition where if you're like a freight rail company and you have somebody that you want to exploit, you'll charge them a different price. And so the Brandeis people advocated building up this like big regulatory state to sort of manage the capitalist competition such that it wasn't happening in a way that just generally harmed society. And,
right.
You know, there's a lot to be said about this, but I think, you know, they leave out some things, but an important conclusion is that, like, this is a pretty successful way of managing a country. Like, when the New Deal more or less settled into Brandeisian lines in the late 1930s, like, that lasted until the 1970s. And it really basically worked all right. You know, they were regulating, you know, trucking and railroads and airlines and, you know, service quality, it, you know, improved steadily. Neoliberals, like, when they deregulated airlines, they point to the price decreases that happened afterwards. It's like, oh, yeah, look at this. Look, this was great. But if you extend the chart to before the deregulation happened, it's like the trend just followed what was happening already, you know, and it probably didn't do anything. And so, like, if you build up a competent bureaucracy and you sort of like try to, you know, like split up the, you know, the markets into, you know, so that no one, and probably like the biggest kind of political aspect of this is that you prevent any one business from becoming so overwhelmingly influential that it can basically dominate the politics of an entire region or the entire country. You know, it's like everyone pays attention to Jeff Bezos, you know, or during the financial crisis, it's like, these big banks are in trouble. And, like, this is a national problem, and we have to cater to them because they're so big. Meanwhile, the FDIC is eating hundreds and hundreds of small community banks, and nobody gives a fuck because they're small. Right. And we know that the system
too big,
will catch them,
too big to fail,
contagion.
right?
Yes, too big to fail. Right. Brandeis, he would absolutely understand that instantaneously. And so, you know, it leaves a lot out. We'll get into that, but I think that his basic perspective, it really has proved itself in a way that you could say, well, for example, like Soviet communism has not. It does work pretty well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it depends what you mean insofar as, like, it didn't work insofar as it didn't maintain its hold on the right. So it's kind of like I'm imagining. Pinning down a kitten that you need to, like, give a kind of a shot to or something. Like, it's like, well, yeah, for a certain amount of time, I think I could do this, but then pretty soon it's inevitable the kitten's going to, like, spring out of my arms, you know, and maybe there's some way in which capitalism will allow itself to be corralled for a time, but maybe it's inevitable that just won't hold. Like, in other words, the question really is this approach something that is sustainable, or is it something that inevitably gets defeated and there needs to be a different tactic or strategy? And maybe that's something that could lead us to think about the ways in which ideologically these different groupings speak both to theory and strategy. So if theory is kind of the critique of what's wrong with society as is, and simultaneously a vision of the good life, like, what, you know, there might be on the left a lot of similarities in terms of at least the vision of the good life, and maybe the critique differs because sometimes the critique then feeds into what the solution is. But then when it comes to kind of the plan of attack to effectuate change, that's where we get to this question of what's going to work over the long term. And if the Brandeisians, are correct about the problem, but there's something about the nature of capitalism that won't let this approach hold, maybe there needs to be a more fundamental restructuring of the economy, and who owns, who has the power and who owns the means of production. I don't know. We can get to that, but it's an interesting question to separate the different things, in terms of what the problem is, what's better, and then how to get there.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say two things about that. The first one is that, like, there's never any end to politics, I think. You know,
that's right.
Constant
struggle.
As Tony Benn once said, you know, every generation, he was talking about the Putney debates back in like the 1600s. And it's just concluded that every generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again.
I think the other thing I've learned from all this, and I'm not a historian or an academic in any way, every generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again. There is no destination called justice or democracy, and if you catch a train driven by the right man, you'll get there. Every generation has to fight it. And that's the interest of the Putney debates and the English Revolution, that we can draw from debates that occurred long before we were born, things that are relevant to us and will be equally relevant to our grandchildren.
But I think that, you know, those... So, you know, you can never find a sort of like end state utopia, you know, the sort of end of history. But I think on the other hand, the point is well taken that, you know, political permanence is a strong, you know, something you have to rate very highly, I would say. And I think this brings us nicely into the second ideological category, which is the social democrats. And here's the second of the big two, and the leftmost presidential candidate, I would say, almost certainly, is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, you know, he calls himself a democratic socialist. He's really just a social democrat. He's not against regulation, but his main thing is welfare and taxes, right? You know, you think about Bernie, it's all about the millionaires and the billionaires and Medicare for all system. You know, so
that's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Maybe we could interview Bernie one of these days. But
let's do it. He retweets you and shares your stuff on Facebook enough. After all,
well, his staff does. I don't, you know.
No, it's Bernie the whole time. Damn it! Don't demystify the burn.
But if you look at the thing about welfare that is not true of regulation, I would say, is that welfare is much more permanent. So, well, let me back up a second. The thing about like social democracy, like this is all these concepts are pretty nebulous. You know, the Bolsheviks called themselves the Social Democratic Russian Workers' Party or something like that in like 1903. But I would say it's fair to say social democrats in a sort of broad Western context means welfare and high taxes. Tax and transfer, you get your universal welfare state, cradle to grave, you know, your baby benefits, your baby box, maternity grant, child allowance, free daycare, free college, unemployment, and retirement, you know, all that stuff.
How's this, Ryan? How's this? It anticipates Polanyi's understanding that economics is embedded, right? It's necessarily embedded in politics and society, and there are shocks that will be really deleterious and harmful to social life if there aren't these kind of shock absorbers put in place ahead of time, right? And it's just the decommodification of certain areas of life that are especially traumatized when they're commodified or when they're prone to market forces. But the market can operate and allocate resources, except in these few spheres from like health and education and environment and shelter, right?
Yeah. And so, you know, the sort of motor of capitalism in the classical context, you know, this a lot of people on Twitter and so forth tend to mock the soak dams and so forth, but you look at the motor of capitalism in classical industrial revolution society, and it is the coercion of the working class through the threat of destitution. You must work. And that includes, like 4-year-old kids. We're going to make a 4-year-old kid size coal bucket that the child can drag up from the mine.
People think that the 5-year plan is a communist thing. It's actually it's capitalistic. The 5-year plan is to get 5-year-olds to work.
Yeah. Pregnant women dragging the coal bucket down the mine. And so, if you take the sort of like social democratic project to its logical extent, and to say like a completed cradle to grave welfare state, that is a pretty radical institution. And because it more or less removes the compulsion of the threat of destitution, because at any point, if you are ever unable to work, then the government will catch you. If you're injured, if you are a child, if you are old, if you're disabled, if you are unemployed, if you get fired or you quit your job, the government will catch you. And it makes it a much more decent, much more egalitarian place. And also, to get back to my original point about political permanence, it's a much more sticky institution. Regulations are easy to get rid of because nobody knows what the fuck they are. You need a pretty disciplined movement behind them. And it's pretty remarkable how long the New Deal regulatory state lasted. It was more or less 40 years from the mid-30s to the mid-70s. But, once they got rid of him, it was like complicated things are happening. It's about this and that. And it was hard to defend. But you're talking about welfare. It's like specific payments to specific people in a very clear, very legible fashion. And when you start trying to take that away, people get fucking pissed. And when, you look at the Republicans in the 2017 when they're trying to repeal Obamacare, they didn't even think about touching Medicare. They thought, they tried sort of quietly cutting Medicaid, which is more politically vulnerable because like poor people have Medicaid and poor people don't vote. They don't vote as much as the rest of the population. But like, you're thinking about the most durable possible institution. It's like everybody gets it. It's good stuff. Universal child daycare, universal health care, NHS, single payer, that spectrum of possibilities. That is a kind of thing that sticks because it's like every single person knows if I don't get this, my life's going to suck. And they will.
And not only that, once that's already delivered, you don't have the right wing critique in operation, which is this: we can't afford this. I mean, do you remember the kind of secret undercover right winger that went to a Bernie AOC rally in the Midwest or something? And she was just like totally seduced by it. And she went on Fox News and she's like, it was really scary because I just loved it. They were talking about how I would have free like healthcare and education for my kids and all that. And it was just like,
great.
It was so amazingly like attractive. And then the one caveat was, so thank God I knew that we can't afford this. Otherwise I would have been totally on board. And that was the only line of defense is we can't afford this. But if you're already getting it, you can afford it. Like that's like it's being done already, right? So like once people have it, that they have zero qualms about it at all, right?
Yeah, and in the case of healthcare specifically, which I think has more or less shouldered itself to the top of the political agenda because the system fucking sucks so bad. It's falling in on itself even for people way, way, way up into the upper middle class. Rich lawyers and such are like, Christ almighty, how much does it cost to put my kids on my health insurance? It's driving home the fact that America, number one, already pays enough in tax alone to fund a very decent healthcare system. Then on top of that, we pay enough in private money to fund another healthcare system. And the second one, more or less, is pure waste, and the implication that we could have better care for less money, or even significantly less money, and that you could have, you could have no tax increase, delete your premiums, and have like 25% more money in your pocket plus Medicare for all. That is a literal possibility for this country right now. And it's like hard to explain to people how complex the horribleness of the system is, but like when you sort of like get into the international comparisons and you say like, this is what other people have in Canada, which is really like what the U.S. would be if we had a proper constitution and not this fucking jerry-rigged piece of shit from the 17th, 18th century. It kind of drives home. And, at any rate, like this kind of, the kind of welfare stuff, Social Security, unemployment benefits, and to the extent that you can put, Medicaid, very popular, Medicare, very popular, that stuff really sticks with people, because they know what it is, and they know how much people depend on it.
Yeah, and this is where, so I think a lot of lefties embrace a lot of the policy proposals that you could classify just purely under social democracy or social democratic proposals. And then a lot of questions, I have students who are, it's not helpful that like social democrat and democratic socialist is almost literally the two same words, just flipped, right? Like that's just very confusing for my students. They're like, wait a minute, what's the difference between these things? But it's further difficult to really understand the difference, and especially when you have somebody like Bernie whose proposals fit squarely into social democracy, and yet he claims he's a democratic socialist. So I think this is worth teasing out. And as we do it, I would suggest that foreign policy might be key, and especially, we've talked about Carl Schmitt and the friend-enemy distinction, especially the understanding of capitalism as a global system, and the ways in which what we do politically here relate to what we do politically and what everyone does politically globally. As some people that are more to the left of your typical social democrats might say, you don't get a Sweden without a Greece, right? Like global capitalism permits some people to have this high quality standard of living with capitalism, but it's required that other places suffer. And so there's an understanding of the interconnectedness within capitalism, that social democracy is something that some people can have, but not something that everyone can have, right? And so this is my first kind of like volley to you to see what you think the real difference is, even though you wrote about it beautifully. So what do you think?
Well, so I would start off by in my sort of particular definitions, democratic socialism is like, it builds on the sort of like social democratic tradition. So you start with your completed cradle-to-grave welfare state, and from there you start thinking about the classic socialist agenda of, public ownership of the means of production. And I think that there's basically two ways you can go about that at this point. You can have state-owned enterprises. We have that in the United States in the forms of the post office and the Amtrak. Other countries, Norway, like 60% of GDP is produced by state-owned businesses. That's probably like the high water mark at this point. It's a lot more than China, which is quote-unquote communist. And, then you can think about like rolling up all the wealth in the country into a, big communal pot. And you could do that in a number of ways. You could say like everything's going to be owned directly by the state. The state's going to direct all the businesses, like a little bit more of a Soviet style, though, of course, with a proper democracy behind it and not a totalitarian dictatorship. But
that's key.
Then you could say, you could go the Rudolf Hilferding, Matt Bruenig route to say that, finance allows the state, the democratic people to get their fingers into the national wealth in a much more simple way by just buying up all the equities and, saying like half or 3/4 of all the wealth should be owned in some way by the state. And, you can have a social wealth fund, which pays out the capital income, the income from people who just own stuff, to the broad population, as it's done in Alaska.
And this is still markets, right? So this is still market socialism, but it's market socialism where you capture, right, capital interests and socialize that, right? You socialize the finance industry to a large degree through the social or sovereign wealth fund.
Having a wealth fund would be a market socialist idea, and I think that's pretty convincing. I think markets are a compelling technology, but they you need to keep an eye on them. And
well, that's the key, right? So as long as markets are subordinate to democratic use of those markets, right, and it's not the demos or the people that are subordinate to what the markets and those who actually control the markets otherwise say they dictate in terms of resource allocation and production, actually, and decision. So this is the thing that's interesting, right? Because you're saying a lot of things that could be done top down, that could just be imposed. But to what extent do you think democratic socialism is about process and about like really democratizing the decisions over what happens politically? There are things that we're talking about now that we think are inherently more egalitarian in the result. But what about the democracy, which is ruled by the people, and what's perhaps distinct from maybe social democracy there? Because it seems to me that like there's this question over what policies are most egalitarian in result, and then what processes or principles of and we talked about this with Robert Hawken a little bit with the Green New Deal. What things are less about the particular policy put in place, but more about who gets to make what decisions? And I don't know if codetermination goes there. That's a Brandeisian thing as well. Or I don't know if somehow fostering co-op. So this is where the lines get blurred a little bit. But we shouldn't forget the democratic part of democratic socialism, right?
Absolutely. And this, I would say, for me, is absolutely foundational. Democracy is the building block on which you have to build anything good in the modern context. And, if you don't have that, you don't have anything. You look at the Soviet dictatorship, the millions and millions of people who died under Stalin. It was because one man had too much power and there was no accountability. There was no democracy. And it's very straightforward. Like Karl Kautsky, who was not a particularly brilliant theorist, pointed out that was exactly what was going to happen before Lenin ever took power. You can't have power without accountability. That's a completely fucking non-negotiable. But yes, as you say, the New Deal, which is very Brandeisian, but it did have a very powerful labor element to it. The national, it was kind of weaselly in its structure. It was like trying to sort of create a truce between capital and labor. Sort of like buy off the workers. But in practice, it did lead to a huge explosion of labor organizing. And in that sense, it was an improvement from the previous status quo. Since become pretty sclerotic.
That's true. And look, we've talked about this before, but both Keynes and FDR were explicitly trying to, at that time, save capitalism from destruction, because it was the left or the right that was threatening the kind of economic liberalism and that order, that kind of that form of political economy. And so this was like, well, if you're going to win against the far left and the far right, you have to protect against these kind of basically the things that neoliberalism doesn't care about, the tremendous like shocks to the social order that like unfettered capitalism has. The reformists like FDR and Keynes are like, no, let's save capitalism by putting these shock absorbers into place. So, but this is an interesting question, right? Because we are so far from actual socialism. The Social Democrats and the Democratic Socialists are basically on the same page in terms of like what needs to be done. Like before there's any real fight between the Social Democrats and Democratic Socialists, we would have to make so much progress that they're basically identical for the near term, right? And that's what's interesting, and maybe something that we shouldn't get too kind of divisive on the left over is what you call yourself, because it's going to look very, very similar for a while, basically, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, Jesus, if we could just get like a Green New Deal and some Brandeisian business regulations, like bust up Amazon, bust up Disney, bust up Microsoft, and yeah, I mean, you know, any business with a market cap over like $100 billion, bust them up.
Yeah.
Because like, why the hell not? You know?
Right.
And this is
that's the thing, right? Like, and as we've talked about before, going after billionaires, normatively, it's good enough to say no one should be a billionaire. I don't even care what the like pragmatic reasons might be. There are pragmatic instrumental reasons, but just as an end in itself, we should tax the wealthy as an end in itself. It also has all these other good, right, like second order effects. But I do feel that the resurgence of the left is a resurgence of some type of understanding of the good life that has principles, because it's been so kind of like neutered by neoliberal. Neoliberalism's project is to neuter all principles of justice, economically at least, in service of a smuggled in normative vision of the unfettered market as morally good, right? And it's just a nice, beautiful thing to see different people on the left with different visions and different kind of analyses about what's going to help and what's not, at least reclaiming the moral high ground of saying, look, all this bullshit is so harmful, and it's just better not to have power concentrated in a few hands. It's so much better to not have grave destitution. And this is something that's been going back, as we've seen, for hundreds of years, but needs to finally overcome what is, I don't know, just almost a renewed Gilded Age right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and particularly talking about worker rights, this is a place where I think the Brandeisians and the Social Democrats and the Democratic Socialists can agree that, like, workers should have a vastly strengthened right to unionize, and workers should get seats on the boards of corporations. The corporations should be partly run, I would say possibly they should be entirely run by their workers. That the CEO should be elected from the managers of the the workers of the company. I think that would work fine. But setting that aside, definitely should get at least 40-50% of the seats on the board, and the legal structure for forming a union should be updated, in line with the kind of European best practices, the Ghent system and so forth, or like where you organize by sector. You have a bargaining thing where it's like you set up the union where whatever exists with the employers, and then you extend the contract across all companies in that sector, so on and so forth. And that, that traditionally has been kind of the heart of lefty politics. And that is something I think virtually everyone should be able to agree on, is a huge expansion of worker rights. I mean, tellingly, Obama in 2009, they were talking about doing card check, this minor little fucking giveaway to unions, and he just like barely, it's like, he just gave up immediately. And it's like, what, where's your politician instincts? Union voters vote
That's
Democrat.
Right.
It's like, why don't you make some more of them? But no.
Well, and that has a lot to do with one's understanding in relation to the status quo, right? Like your picture of the world. And so, and maybe now looking back at the different categories, we can talk about this. But if you don't think current reality is that bad, right? So if your picture of what is that things are mostly good, we could like make them a little bit better, and people, if they work a little harder and we change this and that, we tinker with the economy a little bit, then that's progress. That's good, because people are basically, this is the land of the free, home of the brave. We're flourishing for the most part. Yeah, people have mean thoughts in their heads about people from different races, but other than that, like people are a little misogynist in their kind of, right. This is kind of the neoliberal picture of the world, which is everything is going pretty great. This is, the Steven Pinker thing. My God, there's less violence now than there has been in the history of the world. And this is the march to progress we're on. And if we just kind of tinker with the levers, and yeah, there's some mean people, but look how far, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Let's just like change the kind of quantitative easing method. I don't know, whatever. But like, so seriously, then you're not going to care so much, right? And you're not going to fight. You're not going, because to fight suggests that what is untenable, and you just can't stand it, and you need to risk the violence of conflicts. So like the passivity and the kind of pacifism politically. Now, you could also say more cynically that it's because they're totally funded by the donor class, and so they don't want to lose power. But let's say just like totally sincerely, the Joe Bidens of the world, mostly, I think, act the way they do because they don't feel, they don't understand the actual grave injustices that are pervasive, or they don't understand the actual cause of those things. And they think, like Andrew Carnegie, that they're just like a naturalistic inevitability or something like that. So it's either this like kind of lack of hope, which is to say, this is inevitable, we can't do much anyway, so don't rock the boat, or everything's fine, right? Or I'm in bed with the donor class. It's one of those things, right? But if you see the injustice, if you believe things can change, right? And if you're not in bed with the donor class, then you're going to fight like hell. And then it's just a matter of how to do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, the thing that made the New Deal stick as long as it did was the political tactics and personality of FDR. He was a wealthy man who'd come from privilege, but he was above all the consummate politician. And he realized what so many Democrats today do not, which is that sometimes being timid is the risky option.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That sometimes to be to cement your political legacy, you have to fight, and you have to start up some shit with rich people. And
do you know how much shit Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has gotten from day one? Do you know how much less shit she would have gotten if she like on bended knee just like kissed the ring of Pelosi and Schumer and was just like, just tell me what I need to do. I'm a good soldier. You know what I mean? Can you imagine? Right? But she's just out there throwing bombs, not caring, right, what the consequences are for her career or for whatever. And those risks are actually part of what make her so successful and so popular.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, those things go hand in hand today. Is that she's an outspoken critic of the oligarchy that exists in the United States, and she says things that other, like most of the rest of the party has been too disciplined against to say. Like she has sort of broken through the political crust. It's like this. It's like you're looking at a volcano, and there's the cooled lava on the top that's sort of like trying to hold down the boiling magma underneath. And once there's a crack in it, it just like spews out, And that's the kind of energy she's tapping into. It's like, yes, I've been waiting so long for someone to just say it like it is. And that's the kind of thing that builds really deep and long-lasting loyalty. It's just not bullshit people, and you could be a bartender from Queens from that, but if you're smart and you're able politician, you could be it's like in West Virginia back in the day, they used to hang portraits of FDRs, like put them over the mantelpiece, like he's like a portrait
That's right.
of the
Well,
czar.
And there is this, there is this relationship, if you will, between the people and their leadership that really matter. And the left tends to, well, it's funny because of course the left has its idols and its heroes, and if you're talking about whether it's FDR or Marx or Lenin or what have you. But at the same time, the left also tends to try to kind of reduce the importance of great leadership or great talents from those leaders and talk about the people. And there's obviously a ton of truth to the importance of the mass movement part of it, right? And like Rosa Parks was not just a random individual. She was trained, right, by the NAACP and was an activist. And so she was kind of emblematic of a broader movement. Same thing, MLK didn't do the civil rights movement on its own. He was just a particularly great leader, but he was a great right leader and had amazing rhetorical skill, right? So it's both. And so what you need in these leaders is that they actually reflect and are moved by and responding to the broader movements and the demos that support them. And that's what makes them different from the Donald Trumps of the world, who explicitly on the right say, I am the winner. I will do it for you. It's about me. And I get you, right? Like I can speak your language and I can speak your kind of like racist, xenophobic, right? All the things that make you realize that I hear your voice, but really the solution is me and how great I am. That's the difference, right? And the left populism is actually about the leader being kind of actually emblematic and reflective as much as possible of the broader diversity of that mass leftist movement behind her, right? And so you'll see Bernie in his just recent launch correct the crowd when they're chanting Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. And he'll be like, no, that's not about me. It's about you, right? Now, Obama even gave lip service to this. We are the ones we've been waiting for and so forth. But that was just, a lot of lefties, I think, bought into it. But that was just words without actual commitment or meaning behind it, unfortunately.
Slogan.
This is just a slogan. And when you look at like a Bernie, he's been consistent in his actual politics and the moves and risks he's taken over decades, from being arrested in Chicago and actually being an activist to his actual political stances and so forth. So that's part of the street cred that I think makes him seem like he's got the integrity to be a real representative of the people. But
yeah, I would say that, you have, the kind of the difference between, what Gramsci would call the organic intellectual and or organic leader, which is someone who is sort of just like channeling and articulating the felt grievances of and like political needs of a certain population. And then you have the demagogue. You have people who are basically like whipping up frenzy and hatred amongst a population of people. Your classic leader party, as Ian Kershaw would say, with Hitler or Mussolini, where it's all about playing on the anti-intellectual sentiments of the crowd and
Right.
the base, the mob mentality of people. And I would say, it's there's kind of two things to say in terms of political leadership. It's you got to navigate between two things, which is to say that on the one hand, yeah, the mass movement is important. It you need the people going out, knocking on doors, talking to people, doing the daily work of organizing lots and lots of people. This is a huge country, and it takes thousands or millions of people to really turn it in any sort of way. On the other hand, you really do need the figurehead, the kind of like in chemistry, there's the phenomenon of a supersaturated solution where you have, lots of sugar or something dissolved in water that like more than it theoretically should be able to contain, and you drop a single crystal of sugar into that solution, and it just like crystallizes the entire business, the whole mass of sugar in that solution. And I think that a good leader ought to think of themselves like that, to be like, I am not directing everything. I'm not the dictator, but I do matter, and the choices that I make are important. And you have to think about that, because you can't have a mass movement without leadership. And you look at how the Mensheviks during the Russian Revolution got just totally outplayed by Lenin's more disciplined faction. You have to have a kind of coordination process, and being resentful of that fact is just kind of unrealistic, I would say. And so as we're thinking about these sort of different ideological traditions, you also have, it's worth studying. I actually just got today a second volume in a biography of FDR that was recently published. I forget what we'll post it on the description. I can't remember who the author is, but he was, I think, unquestionably the best president in terms of like keeping the country going forward, rolling forward in a sustainable fashion. Best president in American history. And that was because he was such a quality politician in all senses of the word. He had a little bit of cynicism, but he had a little bit of idealism too. And that, the combination of ability and realistic like thinking and knowledge that the moral foundations of, the democratic republic really matter, combined to create, unlike Lincoln, he set up a lasting political economy, which really persevered until, it was torn apart by the neoliberals. But, he's the only one to have done that.
That's very important, and which isn't to say that he could only have been great. And this is, going back to Machiavelli and his virtue, the virtue and excellence of the leader combines with fortuna or kind of the fortune of circumstance and so forth. But not just the circumstance, but the actual bottom up leftist. So like the extent to which social democracy became part of our political economy is in part because of the far leftier pushing of people on the ground, the more revolutionary socialists. And so there is a dynamic there at play. So even if, and I think you're seeing more of this today, even with like the Jonathan Chaits, even if what you want is more quote unquote moderate, you might appreciate the existence of more radical movements to kind of tug the country closer to that center, right, if you will. So and so there is a way in which the particular politician is taking advantage of those broader dynamics as well. But that of course requires them to have that, you know, prudential wisdom and excellence in kind of political acumen and skill. So all that's important. All of which is to say that I think people today get too hung up on infighting on this particular policy or that particular right. Like nothing drives me more nuts than debating job guarantee and UBI and this version of the Green New Deal as if like the whole country is on board with everything and it's just a matter of ironing out the slight policy differences. Which way, you know, like, can't we just try to push the whole country towards the mindset of a more like decommodified, more egalitarian, more liberatory, more democratic politics and try to, and great, we can have our intra-left fights, but like, it would be awesome for anyone and for everyone to get any one of these things done in the near future. And then like we can build on that. But I think part of what you're saying about what FDR knew is something we could all learn from, which is, sure, have your own vision of what's ideal, but in practice, let's support like anything that pushes us out of this neoliberal order that we're entrenched in currently, right?
Yeah, if FDR had an unparalleled spider sense for the, you know, what you could get and, you know, the space between what would be ideally necessary and what you could get, and pushing that what you could get as close as possible to the what is necessary. And it wasn't there. But like,
right.
He could do that, and he could make that calculation, and he could make it in part, as you say, because he had the backing, you know, behind him of lots of people yelling at him from the left and so forth. But at the end of the day, he was standing at the top of the pyramid, and you know, sort of shunting things in that way, and that's a thing to think about.
So here's a question for you, because, and it might be a moot point, certainly, because it seems like Bernie Sanders seems to have the most, at least anecdotally, the strongest support, passionate, devoted supporters. He raises the most money. He has the biggest crowds and so forth, right? But so that kind of makes it a little bit of a moot point, maybe. But what if that wasn't the case? Like, what if it turns out that Kamala Harris really gets the most support? One can certainly, I could see a Jonathan Chaits of the world or others saying, look, sure, you know, she seems a little bit less, like maybe her integrity and consistency is a little less clear. Maybe, sure, she was part of supporting the carceral state, right? And this, that, and the other, but also she seems very savvy and bright, and clearly she could be an FDR, right? Because who knows what her actual views are, but certainly she wants power. And if it seems clear to her that success and power come from being more to the left, she's going to do that. Something like, right? So how do you combat that kind of logic, which applies to FDR, right? Probably applies to LBJ, applies to a lot of people. When, at least for me, intuitively, I want to say, I don't know. I'm a lot more secure going with a Bernie or even Elizabeth Warren, who, although Elizabeth Warren says I'm a capitalist, both of them seem quite distinct from the rest of the crowd in terms of kind of principle. And I trust them to fight the good fight rather than cave when it comes to it. So how do you evaluate that kind of navigating when it comes to actual electoral politics?
Well, I would say, you know, maybe put a bow on this here, since we're over.
We like bows here at Left Anchor. We love our bows. Because, you know, there's you have the sort of like representational model of the leader, and then you have the demagogue model of the leader. And I would say, you know,
It seems to me, in retrospect, that what Obama was doing in 2008 was more or less like demagogue stuff. He was whipping people up with unrealistic expectations that he had no intention whatsoever of fulfilling. And the reason Bernie, real popular. I think he's got that dedicated hardcore. But should Kamala Harris at this point, she could. I mean, this isn't kind of a problem here because her record is so thin. She has 2 years in the Senate. It's hard to know what she really thinks, but it's when you're thinking about a quality leader, it's hard to the thing you want to avoid. The thing that happened with Obama, at least one of the things you want to avoid, is the cynical, people who sort of like raise people's hopes with the deliberate intention of crushing them. And absent what, from what I've seen from Kamala Harris, some of it's pretty good, but some of it's not so good. Her stuff on, being proud of her record as Attorney General, incarcerating parents of truant children and so forth. Yeah, it's not so great. And it suggests to me that, the reason why demagogues exist is that, rhetoric, media, and so forth, these can really motivate people for a moment. But you also need that strategic intelligence. You need someone who will not fold behind sort of like temporary social pressure if they recognize that what needs to happen is something that is beyond that social pressure. To say that, like, yeah, people are really pissed at me because I'm doing this. This was FDR when he took America off the gold standard in 1933. All the economists in the country basically went and were like, "Oh, FDR, you're doing Benghazi," and he was like, he smiled and nodded at them and said, "Oh, thanks very much." And it's like, fuck you, you ingrates. And he turned out to be 100% correct. That he didn't need to listen to these idiots, and that is the thing that I think is missing yet. We got a whole campaign ahead of us, but from the Kamala Harris and the Kristen Gillibrand and so forth, I trust Bernie to keep his eye on the ball in terms of the broader political economy. Yeah. I trust Warren to at least be like, she hates bankers, and like, that's great. I'm with that. And I think she's, at this point, like a clear kind of second best, but not by too much. I would definitely be very enthusiastic about voting for her. The rest of them just don't trust anybody yet. So, we'll see how it happens.
And this is the other thing I want to tell everyone, because I'm really kind of sick of seeing this already. First of all, I see so many former Hillary Clinton supporters saying to Bernie supporters, if Bernie doesn't win, will you support Beto O'Rourke or whomever it is, right? Like, it's like, first of all, jerks, okay? The number of Hillary Clinton supporters when she lost to Obama, right, that ended up voting for McCain rather than Obama, that's a larger percentage than the number of Bernie supporters who defected to Trump, okay? So the irony of the... Yes, by like a good significant amount. So shut up. So just shut up about that. Secondly, there's a vast difference between, as Noam Chomsky said, he says, there's only one party in this country. It's the business party, but there are two wings, and it matters a great deal which wing you vote for, because a lot of people's lives are affected by that. And that, even if a neoliberal wins, is true. So we should all support whoever the Democratic nominee is, as against the more reactionary, more harmful version representing the business class. But that being said, we get to control and choose democratically to some extent who that's going to be. So like we should normatively push for the best version of what we want, and so we should fight for someone. And so let's stop talking about what we're going to do when the time comes. Let's make the representative be the candidate that we deserve, and push that candidate during the campaign in the primary, during the general election campaign, and once they, God willing, win the presidency, push them as far left as possible to be more liberatory, more egalitarian, and more democratic. So that's the end of my little rant.
Yeah. I think the basic, we're talking about all these ideologies here. The basic lesson of the 2016 election is this. Trump was the most unpopular nominee in the history of polling, going back to the 1930s. He only won because Hillary Clinton was the second most unpopular nominee in the history of polling. And, he's not some Svengali, America whisperer who can't be beat. Anybody could beat him. Anybody except Hillary Clinton. Bernie could beat him. Yes. Beto could beat him. Warren could beat him. Harris could beat him. I or you could beat him. Almost certainly.
Yeah.
I would
definitely
bet money on that. Alexei 2020.
Alexei the Greek 2020. And so the thing is, since that's the case, don't worry about that. Worry about forming the candidate that you think we deserve. And let's go for that. Let's debate that. Let's discuss that. And this has been a fun little thing. So email us, send us your tweets, all the different things to let us know your thoughts. And if you can come up with better versions of You Might Be a Neoliberal If, we'll talk about those in the next podcast. But
please send us fun, your buddy. Best jokes.
Yes,
we can have some funny material.
That's right. And thanks for listening. We appreciate you.
Take care, folks.
See you next time. Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.